Hey, what's up? Today, I'm gonna show you guys how to make what I think is the best tasting Reuben sandwich available to not only the home cook, but to like anyone, anywhere. I'm gonna show you 2 ways to make the corned beef. We're gonna make the marble rye from scratch, and I'm gonna show you how to make a Russian dressing that tastes very good on chips. To get started, I'll need to corn some beef. For that, I'll grab a 4-quart pot and into that measure 175 grams of salt, 50 grams of sugar, 15 grams of pink salt, 10 grams of black peppercorn, 5 to 6 bay leaves, 4 to 5 whole cloves, 10 grams of mustard seeds, and 4 smashed garlics. I'll top that with 1,000 grams of cold water and move this pot over to the stove to bring it up to a simmer. Once that's boiling, I'll kill the heat and let these spices and aromatics infuse this water into a savory meat tea for about 15 to 20 minutes. While that infuses, I'll grab an 8 to 10 pound beef brisket from my fridge and get it trimmed up for brining. Technically, you could throw this brisket right onto a smoker or into a pot, but in some places, as you can see, the fat is over 1 inch thick, and even when properly cooked, that's just too much fat in my opinion. So I'm gonna trim it down till there's about a 1/4 inch fat cap in most places, then I'll flip it over and check the other side for silver skin. This looks good, so now I'll cut it in half. As you can see, this particular brisket still has some of the fatty point muscle on it, and that's preferable in my opinion because when that's fully cooked and rendered properly, it coats your lips like Texas barbecue, which is super dope. Back at my meat tea, it's been about 20 minutes and the aromatics have given all of their flavor to this brine. So now to cool this off and to dilute it to a reasonable salinity, I'm gonna add in 1,000 grams of ice. I'll stir that in, and once it's melted, this corned beef brine now has the perfect amount of salt in the solution and it's no longer hot. Next, I'll pour this brine into a deep 4 to 6 quart container and then load in my beef chunks. I'll top that with a plate to keep everything submerged as best I can, and then I'll load it into my fridge to cure for 10 days. 10 days later, I'll pull this jug of meat out of my fridge and set these beefs up on a wire rack to drain them off. Now, I'll move this sheet tray over to the sink to rinse off any excessive saltiness and any seeds or bay leaves that might be stuck to the outside. Once that's cleaned up, I'm gonna drop one of these 2 halves into my 6.5 quart Dutch oven and the other into my slow cooker, aka an instant pot that is not being used for pressure. I wanted to run a little experiment here to see if I could passively cook this beef on my countertop as effectively as I could in the oven, and I guess we'll see. I'll top both pots with enough water to cover the corned beef, and then I'll bring the Dutch oven one up to a simmer on the stove. Then I'll cover it with a lid and throw it into a 250F 120C oven to slowly cook for about 5 hours. Over at the slow cooker, I'll do the same thing. The lid goes on and I'll set this to cook for 5 hours, but I will check back in 4 to make sure that these meats are working properly. In the meantime, let's make some marble rye. For that, I'm gonna grab my stand mixer, and into the bowl of that, I'll measure 275 grams of warm water, 4 grams of instant yeast, 15 grams of salt, 330 grams of bread flour, 100 grams of dark rye flour, and 300 grams of overnight ripened poolish, or if you have it, sourdough starter. To make this poolish, I mix together 150 grams of water, a small pinch of instant yeast, and 150 grams of bread flour. Stir to combine, top it with a lid, and ferment it here on the counter for 24 hours. 24 hours later, this poolish is all gassed up, buoyant, and alive looking. A poolish is a perfect way to add a ton of fermented flavor to breads without having to maintain a sourdough starter. Now, the dough hook goes on, and I'll mix this dough on low speed for about 3 minutes. The first part of this mix is mainly geared towards getting things gently combined, and once they are like this, I'll turn the speed up to high and mix for 4 more minutes. If you don't have a stand mixer and you want to do this by hand, you definitely can, but I've shown that process a lot on this channel, so I'll link in the description below to some videos where I do hand mix breads for your reference. Once this dough is slapping around cleanly in the bowl like this, I'm going to kill the mixer and add in 15 grams of whole caraway seeds. These seeds go in at the end so they don't shred apart any gluten that we're developing in the first 7 minutes of the mix. Now, I'll spin this caraway in for about 30 seconds or so, and once they're well incorporated into the dough, we're going to turn this off, flip it up, and give it the old tug test to see how that gluten looks. I can tell that it's properly mixed because it doesn't tear or shear, and it holds itself together nicely when I give it a good hard pull like this. So now I'm going to grab 2 vessels so that I can ferment this dough separately in 2 chunks. To get these plastics ready for the dough, I'll hit them with a squiz of olive oil, or pan spray would also work. Then, using a soaking wet hand, I'm going to go into the dough bowl and try to pinch the dough into a 60-40 split. I want 60-ish% of this dough to be the regular rye and the other 40% to be the dark swirly rye. And as for the other half, I'm going to add in 15 grams of molasses. That brings some nice depth of flavor to differentiate the 2 doughs. Then in goes 10 grams of cocoa powder. This is only here for color and is not going to make this bread taste like chocolate, like at all. Now I'm going to mix mix the cocoa and molasses together, but don't start on high speed like me because the cocoa goes airborne. So on low speed, mix this for about 30 seconds or so. Then once it's kind of incorporated, turn it up to high speed for about 30 more seconds. Stop when the dough is looking dark and evenly cocoa colored like this. We don't want to overmix this part. Now I'm going to move that over to container number 2, and then I'm going to stack these and let them ferment together for 2 hours, but I'll check back in 30 minutes later. When I come back, both doughs have had a good chance to rise a little bit, and now it's time for our one and only strength building fold. For that, I'll grab a grip of the dough, pull it out till I meet resistance, and then fold it back over itself. I'll repeat that 3 to 4 more times in total, all the way around the dough, and then I'll grab the seam that I just made and start to round this into a nice taut little ball. This move is a 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock round and tuck type maneuver, and it's probably easier to show you than to tell you. Once this regular rye is folded and tucked up into a nice pretty round like this, I'll repeat it for the dark rye. The lid goes on, I'll restack these 2 doughs and check back in 90 minutes. While that rises, let me thank the sponsor of this video, Future. Going into 2022, like most people, I've set the goal of being more fit, but I don't want to be just one of those people who sets a New Year's goal and then by February is back to doing like no exercise. So to actually get fit, the plan is to get some accountability and structure in place, and Future is a great way to do that. My personal Future coach since October has been Kyle, and when I signed up back in October, I had a one-on-one video call with Kyle to chat about my fitness goals, and from there, Kyle developed a custom workout plan based on that conversation. I told him I wanted to work out 3 days a week with a focus on movement that would help me with rock climbing. Also, if you don't belong to a gym, that's not a big deal. Your Future trainer will develop a custom workout plan based on whatever gear that you have access to. And if you don't already have one, Future will send you an Apple Watch to use during these workouts so that you can stay on track with movement and your trainer can track your progress and your heart rate. So if you want to hit your fitness goal this year, go to tryfuture.co/Brian Lagerstrom to try your first month for just $19. That's cheaper than most gym memberships. That's $19 for your first month. The link is in my description. Thank you, Future. Let's check on the beef. This stuff's been cooking now for 4 hours and I'm pretty positive it's not done, but I do want to show you guys where it's at so that you can get an idea of how this cut of meat progresses under this type of heat. As you can see, when I grip it with 2 forks and try and pull it apart, there is plenty of resistance in there. If you were trying to slice this stuff thin, I would say it's done, but since I'm going for that Texas barbecue style, thick cut, juicy, fatty brisket, I'm going to cook it until it's fully tender. Back in the oven it goes for 1 more hour. When I check back in on my Marble Rye, this dough's been rising for 2 hours in total, and now it's appropriately gassed up and it's looking pretty lively. Now to get this turned into a loaf, I'm going to flour my doughs, then my board, and then I'll flip out the doughs. Having 2 of the same thing right next to each other is pretty fun, you guys. Now I'm going to very lightly flour the top side of these doughs and then degas them into roughly rectangular shapes. I'll mention that if you use too much flour here, the swirls won't stick together properly and the bread might fall apart when you slice it. And if you don't degas this stuff enough, there can be voids in between the layers and that can also prevent the swirls from fusing together. When I've got both of these colors of rye flattened up like this, I'm going to grab my vessel for the finished loaf. For that, I've got a 1.5 pound loaf pan. I'll link to this one in the description because I've used it for several videos at this point and I really like it. I'll hit that loaf pan with some pan spray to keep it from sticking, and then I'll grab the brown layer of dough and drop it right on top of the regular one. From there, using my fingertips, I will assertively press the top layer into the bottom one. Don't be shy with pressure here. It's really important that we get these 2 layers to fuse together properly. Once I've got a good seal like this, I'm going to grab the top of the dough and then roll it back over itself by 2 or 3 inches, while also pinching down and forward to create tension and to seal the dough. I'll repeat that roll move 10 or so more times from the top to the bottom. And again, I'm pressing the dough away and down from myself to create that tension and to seal that roll. It's kind of like a chubby baguette at this point. And once it's all rolled up, there should be only light rye on the exterior like this. Now I'll scoot this into the bread pan that I just sprayed up and then tuck it in a little bit to make sure that the loaf is evenly distributed from end to end and side to side. Then I'll cover it with a tea towel and proof it for 1 hour to 90 minutes. Now, just before that bread is going to be done proofing, I'm going to check on my corned beef one more time. This meat's been slowly cooking for roughly 5 hours at 250F, and when I grab it with tongs and pull it with a fork, you can see that I can just about shred this apart, but the fibers are still holding everything together, but just barely. This is my preferred doneness less of a corned beef for a Reuben, but feel free to cook yours slightly less or slightly more based on what you like. Now let's check on the slow cooker one. As you can see, this beef is almost as tender, maybe slightly less so. That's thanks to the water temperature mainly. The slow cooker water was rolling at about 200 F, 94 C, and the Dutch oven water was rolling at 206 to 208, about 98 C. The gentler temperature of the slow cooker for about 5 hours is actually how I would probably do this moving forward, because the final product was amazing and slightly less shreddy than the Dutch oven. Next, I'm gonna set this hot meat aside and then preheat my oven to 460 F, 235 C to get it ready for baking my bread. Speaking of that, let's check back to see if it's proofed up enough to bake. After 70 minutes of proofing, this loaf is looking great, and when I poke it, you can see that it's full of gas, but it in no way deflates from that poke. Now, using a razor blade or a serrated knife, I'm gonna score this loaf 7 to 8 times on the diagonal across the top. And wow, you can already see some marbling in there. That looks sick. Once that's scored, I'll load it into my preheated oven and then immediately spray it and the box with a bunch of water to create some steam. Tall panda loaves like this one don't really need as much steam as other types of hearth bread, so I just hit it with a spray bottle and it does a pretty good job giving us good crust. I'll bake this loaf at 2 temperatures too. The first 15 minutes is going to be at the original 460 F, and then about halfway I'm going to come back and open the door to cool it down to 400 F, 205 C, and I'll bake it for about 20 more minutes. After 35 to 40 minutes in total, this loaf is looking really well baked and it's ready to come out. What I love about using the high heat at the beginning here is that we get that really nice rustic crust on top. That's going to be a great counterpoint to the soft sides that were steamed in the pan when we make this sandwich. Perfect for a Reuben. Now I'm going to let this cool while I quickly make the last thing that I need before we build this sandwich, and that's creamy Russian dressing. To make that into a high-sided container, I'll combine 1 yolk from a large egg, 20 grams of rinsed red onion, 5 grams of garlic, or just about half of a clove, 30 grams of bread and butter pickles, 5 grams of salt, 2 grams of black pepper, 50 grams of ketchup, and 20 grams of sriracha. Now, my immersion blender goes in, and I'll spin this, or try to spin it. The wet stuff's on the bottom, so after a few seconds of mushing this down, there we go. Now things are spinning and that egg yolk is mixed in. Now I've got 275 grams of neutral oil here, and with the blender spinning, I'm going to stream that in slowly until things start to get a little bit thick. From there, I'll stop, make sure that that oil is spun in, and then I'll continue to drizzle once it is. After maybe a minute in total of spinning, the onions and garlic are well broken down and all of the oil has been fully emulsified into the egg. I wish that I could describe the taste of this dressing without using an abundance of hyperbole, but just take my word for it. It tastes very, very, very good. Also, it doubles as probably the world's best tasting chip dip. I beg you to give this recipe a try. It's so good. Checking back on the baked marble rye, it's had a chance to cool down and now I can finally cut into it. And that's a pretty good looking swirl right there, dude. I'm gonna be pretty honest. I'm happy with how that looks. It's got an excellent open looking crumb as well, and it smells deeply of caraway. I think this is gonna make a super good vehicle for salted beef. Speaking of that, I've got a huge chunk of it on my cutting board here, and as a reminder, I let this rest and cool slightly in its own cooking liquid for about an hour, but it's still nice and hot. For the sandwich, I'm gonna be slicing this corned beef into roughly 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick slices because I want Flintstone sized chunks of meat on this thing. But if you liked it thinner, I would say cook the corned beef slightly less. Now to build this sandwich, I'm going to drop down some Swiss cheese. Gruyere or provolone would also work, but they're probably a little bit too flavorful in my opinion. Then behind that comes a thick layer of corned beef. I've got about 6 or 7 pieces here that I'm layering in 2 layers, and make sure you get the structural integrity of this part right. Behind the beef comes a large pile of refrigerated store-bought sauerkraut. I go for the Bubby's brand when I'm buying sauerkraut because it's just salt and cabbage and it's super crisp. I debated showing you guys how to make sauerkraut in this video, but it was already pretty dense with process, so I thought that I'd save that recipe for another day. Bubby's is great and it tastes literally identical to the stuff that I would have made. Lastly, I'm gonna gild this lily with 2 strong dollops of that Russian dressing. Then I'll flip the lid onto this sandwich and the whole setup is gonna go over to my stove to get toasted. I wanna clarify that when I say toast, I'm really just trying to melt the Swiss and get just a little bit of baseline texture on the outside of this rye. It's already pretty crusty, and if you were to over toast it, you would have tons of bread glass basically that would make this sandwich really hard to eat and hard on your mouth. After about 3 minutes of toasting, that's a pretty special looking sandwich. The rye and the corned beef combined here just do something to me that is so emotionally deep. The sandwich also hits pretty hard physically, I'm not gonna lie to you, but as a rare treat, you really couldn't do much better, and I really hope you guys give it a try soon. Let's eat this thing.